What if the government could block the news before it's even published? What if journalists could be punished for telling the truth? To people in the US, these questions may sound like a plot point in a dystopian novel or movie, but it's a real concern some may not often consider. And once upon a time, it was a major problem for the people who wrote the Constitution. If you are worried right now about the media being censored in ways we haven't seen before, you should be. It's happening. We keep hearing about the Trump administration using the courts and the Department of Justice to pressure and punish news organizations for their coverage on domestic and international issues and topics, raising serious questions about the freedom of the press in our time. So today we're talking about freedom of the press, why it matters, how it works, and who it protects. And if you've been with us from the beginning, you might remember we started with freedom of speech. This episode, we're focusing on freedom of the press. Because while free speech is about your right to speak, freedom of the press is about who gets to amplify that speech, who gets to challenge power, and who gets to investigate, uncover, and tell the story. Let's press into it. Yes, that's a pun. You're welcome. The Constitution says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. But what does that mean? At its core, freedom of the press means the government can't control what the press publishes. It can't punish journalists just because they publish something critical or uncomfortable. And the press doesn't just mean newspapers anymore. It includes TV, radio, podcasts, websites, and independent reporters. A free press is a cornerstone to democracy. It helps make sure our leaders stay honest or calls them out when they're not, keeps the public informed, and exposes injustice. The press is often called the fourth estate, which serves the public by providing an independent check on the three branches of government, not just federally, but at the state and local levels as well. Let's jump back to the 1700s. Real Americans weren't just drinking tea and wearing powdered wigs. They were also obsessed with writing and sharing pamphlets. You know, like the original viral post. Thomas Paine's Common Sense could be considered one of the first viral pieces of content in the US, and it basically helped start a revolution. During British rule, colonists saw what it looked like when the government could control information. There were bans on printing criticism of the king, and publishers could get jailed for seditious libel. That's why the founders made freedom of the press one of the first protections in the Bill of Rights. They knew that a democracy without a free press can't be a democracy for long. So what can't the government do when it comes to the press? First, prior restraint is a big no-no. Prior restraint is when the government blocks speech or expression in advance. Doing this is presumed to be unconstitutional, and even in cases of national security, courts treat them with heightened scrutiny. Second, the government can't punish media outlets just because they publish something unflattering. So if a journalist uncovers government corruption and suddenly their press pass is revoked or they're targeted, that's a red flag. Third, public figures, including politicians and businesses, can sue the press for defamation, but it's really hard to win. Defamation cases involving private individuals and public issues require proving that there was negligence. Involuntary public figures often have additional protections. The Supreme Court says you have to prove the information was false and that the journalist published it with actual malice. This means you have to have concrete proof that the reporter or outlet knew the information that they were sharing was false or inaccurate. That's a high bar, and that's on purpose. The courts want to protect a vigorous and uninhibited press. Fourth and finally, the government can manage who gets a press pass to a briefing, but they can't deny anyone access based on content. In other words, you can't block a journalist just because you don't like their coverage. Which brings us to shield laws. Being a journalist isn't just getting good scoops and publishing dramatic exposés. It also involves legal landmines. Shield laws are state-level protections that allow journalists to protect their sources. Some states are strong on these, others not so much. And there's no federal shield law, so it gets messy. In Brandsburg versus Hayes, a case from 1972, the Supreme Court said that journalists do not have a constitutional right to refuse to testify before a grand jury. Ever since Brandsburg, if a court subpoenas you, you might have to spill the tea, even on confidential sources. There have been numerous landmark Supreme Court cases that have shaped the media landscape and the protections media has under the First Amendment. To tell us more, let's pass it over to Alex.
Ever since the Bill of Rights was adopted, what is and isn't covered by the freedom of the press has been contested and refined over time. In fact, we didn't know whether freedom of the press extended to critics of the government. Toward the end of the Vietnam War, President Richard Nixon set his sights on censoring the New York Times for publishing the Pentagon Papers, a comprehensive documentation of the United States' many failures in Vietnam. Many of these overseas failures were unknown to the public, who largely believed that the U.S. was winning the war. Publication of the Pentagon Papers shocked the nation. Nixon, enraged by the papers' leak, declared that releasing such a document to the public was against the national interest and thus unprotected. The New York Times, on the other hand, asserted their First Amendment right, arguing that the Nixon administration's attempt to prevent the Times publication was unconstitutional prior restraint. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times, expanding the freedom of the press to include the publication of even highly sensitive material of public importance. The ACLU was at the forefront of the fight, being one of the first organizations to file an amicus brief in support of New York Times free speech. The ruling solidified the future of the press in the United States. No outside force, even at the highest levels of the federal government, could censor public press under the First Amendment. However, this decisive ruling has not stopped some administrations from trying to do just that. More than 50 years after the ruling, President Trump recently sought to censor the media he and his administration deemed as critical of the government. In February 2025, he banned the Associated Press from all White House press conferences because the global news organization maintained a standard of referring to the Gulf of Mexico by its original and internationally recognized name, rather than folding to Trump's new name for the body of water, the Gulf of America. The AP has since sued the administration for a violation of the First Amendment's freedom of the press. Shortly after, a U.S. district judge ruled to have AP's press conference access reinstated immediately, but an appeals court paused that decision a few months later. The battle will undoubtedly continue given Trump and his administration's hostile track record of attacking the freedom of the press and other crucial First Amendment freedoms. Angel, back to you.
Thank you for that explanation, Alex. So we've talked a lot about the rights of reporters and the press, but you may be asking yourself, how does this affect me? Well, a free press creates a vibrant environment for all of us to gain exposure to new ideas and information, and a wide range of information and opinions. We've already shared some of the unique protections members of the media have under the freedom of the press category. But as a part of the larger First Amendment, many of the protections provided to the press extend to everyday people too. For example, many states, including Arizona, have public records laws that allow anyone to request official documents and records from any government entity or officer. The Freedom of Information Act, sometimes shortened to FOIA, functions similarly at the federal level. While reporters and news outlets frequently seek records for their reporting, anyone can submit requests. The American Civil Liberties Union and the ACLU of Arizona routinely ask for records, and when we don't get them, we sometimes sue to enforce the public records laws that are essential to hold the government accountable. Another way that the freedom of the press intersects with everyone's First Amendment protections is when documenting and reporting on law enforcement activity in public. This includes your local police department, county sheriffs and deputies, and even federal law enforcement like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE. In 2022, the Arizona State Legislature tried to curb this right by passing a law that banned recording the police in public within an 8-foot perimeter. With the rise of camera phones and social media, it goes without saying that video has become a key tool to hold law enforcement accountable for widespread police brutality and abuse. The ACLU of Arizona joined 10 media organizations in a lawsuit to permanently block the law, because whether it's an individual filming police at a protest or a news film crew reporting in front of a crime scene, we all have rights. The court quickly ruled in our favor before the law took effect, because it was obviously unconstitutional. So in summary, a free press isn't just a right, it's a necessary component of a functional democracy. It's how we shine light on power, keep the government in check, and protect democracy itself. For next week's video, did somebody say God? Where does religion fall into all of this? Because when it comes to religion and religious beliefs in the US, the Constitution has some thoughts. We'll dive into it next week. Until then, remember, you have rights. Make sure you know them.